Okay, well, first things first, welcome. It's great to see pretty much a room full of folks here for the event. The forum's been going a long time now, right? 2005 is when we put it together. So the fact that we still have a big turnout for events that we're putting on twice, 3 times a year sometimes is a great testament to the fact that we must be doing something interesting to get everybody around the table here. So this presentation, I'm going to try and get out of the way as fast as possible. The main interesting thing about this session this morning is just to give you a very quick overview of where the forum is going as a sort of organizational direction, and give you an opportunity to ask questions, which is the piece at the end. So be thinking about things you might want to ask. I'll try and answer any question that you can come up with, but I reserve the right to fall back on the 42 answer if you ask me a question that I'm not entirely sure what the right answer should be. So let's get into it so that you guys can get out of here and on to the most interesting testing of the most interesting part, which is the testing. Okay, so the sections in the presentation here, quick overview of things that I wanted to make sure everybody's aware of that form the backbone of the event. A little bit about the forum itself. That's a cue for me to ask, how many in the room first-time visitors to a Plugfest? Can I get a show of hands? Great, well, welcome. Anybody not done very much work with the forum before? This is like the first few months that you've been working on UEFI and new to the community? Maybe 1 or 2. Okay, so old hands in the room mostly. That's good. So I'll do the old hands version of this rather than the full long version, since we've got a lot of experts in the room. Okay, security, I'm going to come back to that several times over. I think there's a theme there that we need to take on board as a community, so I'm going to say quite a lot about security things this morning. So I'm going to start there to plant the flag, and we'll come back to that topic several times. Okay, so first, this sort of event would not be possible without the help of sponsors, so I need to thank everybody that's done that. I'm not going to read all the names out. You can ingest the logos with your eyes faster than I can try and read off all the companies there, but this kind of event cannot happen without these companies being willing to pony up some of the funds and resources that it takes to put an event like this on. So we very much appreciate the help and sponsorship and support that those companies provide for us. Okay, something new that we're adding to the forum format this time is this idea of speakers' office hours. So there are sessions that will be taking place in here talking about various technical topics. What we've done is added an hour where the speakers will come back later in the afternoon. I think it's 3 p.m., is that right? 3 p.m. each day. And the speakers will be in here, so if you have follow-up questions or you wanted to expand on the discussion when we didn't get time to get a full set of Q&A during the actual presentation slot, there's a second chance at that. And again, that's something we've added as a result of feedback that we've gotten from previous events. So when I plug the survey in a minute here, this is a result of previous surveys. So thank you for those that responded. If there are things that you would like to see more or less of at future events, that survey will be a big help in helping us decide what to do there. So there's the link for the survey. I believe everybody will get a follow-up email after the event, and you'll get a copy of that link. So no need to scribble it down now in great haste. We'll send that to your inbox. But like I said, we really do pay attention, and we are trying to make these events as interesting and productive for you as possible. So any guidance you can give us on what to do with future events would be much appreciated. Okay, let me talk just very briefly about the forum. No great changes in the structure. So since most of you in the room are old hands, I probably don't need to describe this in great detail. I would say that from an activity point of view, the communications work group is responsible for a lot of the planning and setup and logistics that go into events like this, so that group's pretty active. I know the ACPI group has a lot of work on its plate at the moment. The PI work group is doing a little bit of work on some updates to specifications. The UEFI spec group is a little quiet at the moment. And the testing folks are forever grinding to get closer to the leading edge in terms of being ready for us with up-to-date self-certification tests. So there's work going on in pretty much the entire breadth. And again, as I mentioned before, the fact that this organization's been going more than 10 years and we still have that momentum, the fact that we have work group meetings that are weekly and we're typically getting quorum when we call those meetings, that's a pretty good testament to the fact that we must be doing something right and that there's useful work going on there for everybody to keep participating. And the fact that it's done in such a collaborative, collegial fashion is actually pretty unusual. So for those of you that don't spend a lot of time in other standard setting bodies, just let me take a moment to observe that you are pretty lucky working only with this group and how productive and helpful and positive an environment it really is. And I think for me personally, that's one of the things that I am most proud of about this organization, is that we've consistently maintained that environment where all voices around the table are heard, and that we really take all of those contributions and make a positive outcome with a collaboration and the good of the entire community as kind of our raison d'etre. And this organization does a really very good job at that. So again, in part, that's thanks to all of you. So I very much appreciate everybody coming to the event today and bringing that outlook with you. Okay, so just briefly to dive into the specifications. Just for the record then, if you read across here, these are the number versions of the latest and greatest specifications. The last year was pretty much of an unusual one. We'd never done this before, in an attempt to coordinate all three specifications that provide the primary interface definitions, the PI spec, the UEFI spec, and the ACPI spec, all at once. And the reason we did that, primarily bringing those two new versions all simultaneously, was that we had a topic that sort of spanned all three. The non-volatile memory technology support for that new feature that's arriving in platforms across the industry really gave us the impetus to say, well, hey, we need a little bit of modification in all of these specifications. So again, a pretty interesting effort to try and coordinate that many people across that many different subject areas all at once and produce a simultaneous set of specifications. So I don't know about anybody else in the room. I would like to avoid having to do that again anytime soon, because it really was a lot of work. But again, amazing testament to the flexibility and capability in the organization as a whole, that we can actually do that. Again, pretty rare. The updates, I guess, had that idea of some amount of maintenance work in them as well, and that will be continuing. I mentioned that the PI work group is working on a little bit of a spin to the document there, a minor update version. That is largely driven by understanding of implementation work. We found some limitations in doing some PI implementation that require us to revisit the specifications, so we're making some changes there. So it's not so much driven by new functionality coming or new features and products that we need to support. That's mostly about learning as the implementation catches up with the interface specs. That is probably the primary theme in terms of where we are with the specifications at the moment. Right now, I'm not aware of any great drivers for changes to the specifications in terms of things that we don't have coverage for, new features or new capabilities that we want to add. Those kinds of things typically tend to be set as the pacing items for new versions of the specifications. So as soon as one of those pops up, we might be able to do something like set the schedule for the next specification. So it's not a bad thing every now and then, and we've done this 2 or 3 times in the length of time that the forum's been in existence, to take a pause in specification work, moving the state of the specification art along so that the implementation work can catch up. And we're kind of in that phase right now. My historical observation is that it's pretty typical that I get to say something like that at 2 Plugfests in a row, but unlikely that it's going to be 3. So I had this kind of message for everybody at the Taipei Plugfest last fall, and now here we are in spring, and I'm kind of in the same mode. Nobody's come to me and said, hey, it's time for us to crack open the book and add something for this new technology or this new capability that we want. So I'm half expecting maybe not today or this week, but before too terribly long, something in the ecosystem will occur to us collectively that we start to be looking at moving the state of the specification forward again. So if you had an itch to start thinking in that way, I'm happy to hear that and start preparing for that move forward, because history says we're approaching the time when that might be there. But for now, the official stance anyway is we're holding the specifications, waiting for something to motivate us to move on. Okay, so let's talk about security. I don't suppose there's any surprise that this would be an important topic to speak about right about now. I don't know about any of you, but I certainly have had lots of fun and entertainment in the first quarter of this year as a result of Spectre and Meltdown and all of the fun things that came from that exercise. I think as far as the community is concerned, firmware people in general, certainly my observation again anecdotally for Intel, we're more chickens than pigs if you think about the breakfast metaphor in this case, right? There wasn't anything that we had to do that was fundamental to fixing the lion's share of the problems in the firmware space. A lot of the workarounds and things were really propagated through the operating system space. But that is probably more accident than design if you look at it in terms of where the researchers are spending their attention. So I think it's kind of an important call to all of us to say, hey, the attention on system software in general and attempting to find problems around systems is pretty high. We know that the OS community, maybe, I don't know how you would calibrate, how many years ago, the OS community in general sort of took several years to get its collective act together around security. The fact that the researchers are looking at side channels in CPU instruction streams now, right? They're looking from right inside the machine to the top of the operating system and up into application space. There's no place to hide, and that includes us in the firmware space. So I think it's pretty important that we take on board security as an important thing that we need to pay attention to. So I really want to encourage everybody to be involved in the conversation. I really do think this is we're all in it together kind of a situation. Our ecosystem is maybe not unique, but certainly a little unusual in that if you look at the flow of content from where I sit in Intel, I'm a silicon company person. If you look at collateral that flows from there all the way to systems that find their way into the field, there are several actors on that path, right? Typically OEMs, IHVs, the IBV community as well, and the collateral passes through multiple stages of integration. That means all of us have our fingers in the work to produce a robust image in the field that can withstand the potential for attacks and things of that sort. So I think it's up to all of us to make sure that the robustness of implementations that end up in customer hands is really up to the task as much as we reasonably can. There's no such thing as 100% perfect defense against all possible threats that you might think of ever. But I think if I were to take an honest assessment, I think as a community, we have more that we can do compared to what we have done to this point in this particular space. So I would really encourage everybody to get engaged. There is going to be no shortage of challenges, right? Spectre Meltdown affected the CPU folks, and they did workarounds in the OS space. There's nothing to say that next week we might not get a notification that there's a major problem somewhere in the firmware space that we have to all react to very quickly. Excuse me. Use the fact that we're all in the room here together to spend some time talking about this sort of problem and talking about those seams, right? If I talked about collateral that finds its way through multiple sets of hands on its way to end users, there are seams there, right, between our organizations. Let's talk about, use the opportunity we have everybody in the room here to talk about how we best do the business of maintaining good robustness for the entirety of the code as it makes its way through that integration process. Okay, so this one's a little bit of I'm going to whine a little bit here. It's a bit of a complaint, and I'd like everybody's indulgence for a minute. we've spent a lot of time looking at adding interfaces to the UEFI specification in particular, and PI a little bit as well. A lot of brain power has gone into making those specifications as good as we reasonably can, and implementation experience has helped us refine those, right? Some of the things that we added in the UEFI 2.7 spec in terms of variable support changes last year came out of the fact that we learned a thing or two in implementing UEFI Secure Boot as a feature that needed improvement in the interface definitions. But at this point, I think we've had some of the brightest minds in our ecosystem, certainly, and some dedicated security research folks take a look at this interface set and tell us that it's in pretty decent shape, but only as far as our implementations actually follow what we wrote down. And we have discovered in a number of cases out in the wild, some of the implementation work that we've done behind this collectively hasn't really lived up to the diligence that we put into the specification. So my whine is, please, 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 right? I think we need to pay attention to our quality of implementation. And partly because of all of this integration flow that I just talked about, we're kind of all bound together here, right? So a slip on the part of one piece of the implementation community effectively craters us all, right? The outside world looks at BIOS firmware as a holistic thing, and if there's a problem with it, all the people that were involved, are going to kind of be on the hook to be responsible for that. So again, it's for everybody's benefit that we all, put our weight to the oar and make sure that we do as good of a job in implementation terms as we possibly can. So not that I would tell the outside world, but I think we can do better on implementation. And I would challenge us all to think about that as something we need to pay good attention to going forward. Okay, and then the other thing, which is more of a conversation about things that we need to move towards doing better in the future, is dealing with updates. The speed at which malware can find its way across the internet is positively frightening. Positively frightening. If we were to get the equivalent of a Heartbleed style attack, right, where every system in the world is affected in the firmware space, that could propagate at internet speeds, and our ability to respond quickly, if I look at our capability today, is extremely limited, right? I mean, I've had conversations with some of you in the room. It could take as much as 6 months to build an update, validate it, get it ready to the point where we can ship it out the door. Well, 6 months compared to a few hundred seconds, maybe, for a piece of malware to circulate the globe is a pretty interesting mismatch, right? And we've been lucky to this point that the community hasn't really been affected by a piece of malware that's going to brick every system or cause some major compromise of customer data out in the field as a result of an exploit in the firmware space. But if you can imagine it, and I just described too, right? If you can imagine it, some malware creator somewhere is thinking about doing it. Again, I think, as a matter of insurance against future trauma, attention to doing a better job with propagating updates, both the ability to create them as we need them, and then distribute those, perhaps up to and including push updates to systems already sold into the field, is going to be something that I think we're going to need to pay more attention to than we have in the past. And oh, by the way, I think it says something also about the lifespan for which we're going to have to support systems that get shipped into the field as well, right? I talked to my colleagues in the Internet of Things group, and they have some interesting customers in embedded and automotive kinds of spaces who tell them that 7 to 10 years is pretty much average lifespan for a system in the field. I think it's pretty unusual, if I did a poll around the room here, I think it would be pretty unusual to find an organization that is set up to issue a patch tomorrow for a system that we sold even 5 years ago. I don't know whether anybody would make the claim that they can do that, right? Maybe, maybe not. But in that kind of context, right, if you're selling into a market where systems have that kind of longevity, this is something that I think we're going to need to potentially take on board, right? And again, I go back to Meltdown Spectre, right? Think how far back into the catalog of CPUs my parent company had to go look to see whether we were potentially at risk, and thinking about fixes that we had to make, because there are still systems in the field that people are using day to day that have those parts. Anyway, so I'm not going to necessarily advocate any one particular solution to this problem, but I wanted to plant the bug in everybody's ear. I think we have to have a conversation as an ecosystem about updates and getting from the point where, 6 months to spin an update for a system that might be as old as 9 to 12 months, but no more, right? That's the extent of our ability today. I think we have to raise that bar significantly. So hopefully that will be part of our thinking going forward. Okay, so the slide that comes with the no plan survives first contact with the enemy disclaimer, right? What we're thinking in terms of sort of top-level direction going forward. I think it's actually pretty safe, though, to say that security is going to be a continued focus because there are a lot of folks looking at what we do with an eye to improvement or exploit. The research community and the malware community, I think we have a nice large roundel target, right, painted on us at the moment as a collective ecosystem. So I don't think we're going to get away from focus there anytime soon. Right now, as I mentioned, I don't have any pacing items for any of the specifications in terms of things to add that are new. So anything we do in the way of updates will be kind of along the same lines that the PI spec is going. What we learn from implementation drives a few changes, perhaps. So we'll be responsive to that, but right now I'm not aware of anything that is going to be, new big splashy feature that we need to go add to the specification. If you're aware of one, let me know. And we can start working towards that. Broad architecture support continues. So one of the things that is most gratifying to me about this work, right? I mean, obviously I work for a company that produces a particular CPU architecture, but we have several that are in the specification. And a lot of the work that we're doing now is driving the level of support and the ability to exploit the code in the open source implementations of the specification set across a much wider range of platforms. And it's pretty amazing to me to see the range of machines that have UEFI technology in them somewhere, in some piece of the PI implementation alone perhaps, or even full-on UEFI stacks that are capable of booting multiple operating systems. I don't know whether we'll get any new CPU architectures. There's a couple floating around on the periphery that we might see some interest from other communities. But from a directional point of view, if anybody else has another architecture they want to bring in, we'd certainly be open to that and continue to expand. Okay, so that's the going forward statement. Speaking of going forward, the next event will be in the fall in Taipei, and our friends from AMI will once again be hosting that. Thank you for doing that, chaps. And the date is sort of mid-October there, so as the admonition puts there, save the date. Hopefully we'll see some or all of you in Taipei in the fall after this event. Okay, so that's pretty much all I had to say in terms of setting up. So now you've been thinking about questions, hopefully. Let me open it up and see whether anybody has questions. I don't know where the microphone went to. Brian has it. Anybody got a question?
It's on, okay. So just to add to what you said about going back further in time with updates,
right.
The Spectre and Meltdown, we had to work very closely with customers, and we saw customers using much older systems than we ever envisioned. Even going back,
deja vu.
Even going back earlier than you guys ended up releasing microcode updates for. So
I can believe it.
Customers are still using stuff that's 10 years old or even a little older than that, which is really surprising.
A testament to the excellence of the design you did, though, right? Because the
testament
the fact
that we can
still
find all the source for all those old platforms. But anyway, it is true. We've seen the Dunnington, the Wolfdale, really, really, really old stuff.
Right.
People are still using it.
Yeah. Yeah, it is, I think, it certainly surprised us when we went and talked to customers. I think it certainly surprised us, how much relatively aged machinery there is out there, right? I mean, to a first approximation, I at least heard one platform architect in the halls of Intel say, well, hey, power supplies don't really last much more than 5 or 6 years, so those machines are all dead by now, surely. But of course, it turns out not to be true. There are much older machines out there in quantity.
Yeah, I think that actually goes, Mark, to something that we've talked about is shifting our mentality. We love to be technology people, We're probably infrastructure people, and we don't know it because it doesn't sound as cool. And it changes the way that we look at how we maintain things and how we kind of keep our systems up and running. So it's not like the coolest thing to be a plumber, but it kind of is, the thing that people want when the pipes break. So we just have to make plumbers sound cool. That's a marketing problem. I'll have to
Yeah, I
solve
was
that
going
later.
to say, I think the communications work group should take that one up, right, to make plumbing sound cool. That's a good directive.
We have any other questions for Mark?
Or for each other. Okay, seems like everybody wants to get to work. Again, thank you for being here. Enjoy the event.